Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the second program in the Local History Division series on women's suffrage and women's history. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division of the Rochester Public Library. Our speaker today, Dr. Barbara LeSavoy, is someone I'm very proud to have worked with on multiple projects over the past few years. And in talking to her about our plans for this series and asking what she might be able to present, she suggested doing a program on suffrage around the globe. I thought this was a great idea. When we talk about women's suffrage in the United States, we do tend to focus just on the movement in the United States and not on the fact that it was part of a much larger, much more diverse and temporally spread out process than we see in the United States. Well, we may be familiar with, say, the Iron-Jawed Angels of the UK. The fact is that there was a suffrage movement across Europe and across the world. And I and the rest of the programming team thought that having Dr. LeSavoy speak on this much larger concept of a global suffrage movement would be a great way to help start out our series. Dr. Barbara LeSavoy is Associate Professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the College at Brockport. She served as director, then chair, over a span of 12 consecutive years, where she built a small program into its current department status. She teaches feminist theory, global perspectives on women and gender, race, and class, and a senior seminar in women and gender studies. Her research and publication areas include women's global human rights, identity politics in literature and popular culture, and historical to contemporary perspectives on gender equality. Her most recent scholarships includes 2 forthcoming co-authored book chapters, Seneca Falls and Legacies of Women's Rights, and Technologies of Affect in Memorializing Holocaust Trauma. Dr. LeSavoy serves as lead faculty for a global classroom linking students at the College at Brockport with students at Veliky Novgorod State University in Russia, and she has taught a Women and Gender Studies seminar for several summers at the New York St. Petersburg Institute of Linguistics, Cognition, and Culture in St. Petersburg, Russia. Among her many accolades, Dr. LeSavoy is the 2017 recipient of the Brockport Presidential Award for Teaching Excellence. Without further ado, Dr. Barbara LeSavoy.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I'm so thrilled to be here, and thanks for that great introduction. Just to check, everyone can hear me okay? Yeah, my voice is like, okay. Great, so I have a prepared talk. It's actually like a very much longer paper, about 30 pages, and I've extracted out of that about 12 pages. It takes me about 30 to 35 minutes to go through my talk if I stay on script, if I stick with my words. So my goal is to go through the paper. I'm going to show you some slides as I talk, and then leave opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So just an opening up, as the US pauses to mark this important centennial passage of the 19th Amendment, we must remember that the battles for women's enfranchisement unraveled across a global stage. So my talk today is geared to examine women's suffrage from this global perspective, and I'm going to highlight ways historical roots leading up to our 19th Amendment developed in this global context. Tracing the timing and progression of women's suffrage around the globe, I'm going to consider ways suffrage movements and campaigns varied worldwide, but more so ways they were interconnected across countries and people. My closing remarks reflect on the status of women's freedoms today and the significance of women exercising civic voice in affairs of state, nation, and empire. So one important qualifier about the world and its size, it is impossible for me to give you detailed coverage of what transpired everywhere. If I did that, we'd be together way too long. And so my goal here is to give you an overview so that we can then connect the dots around the world and place our own US centennial in this global context. But I do want to say I apologize in advance if I step over a country of origin that's important to you, or even just a country that you are interested in. So Before I jump into looking at the global portrait over on this 100th year US milestone, let's remember collectively that the 19th Amendment did not enfranchise all US women, as race, racism, and remnants of slavery, particularly in the South, prevented many Indigenous and women of color and other non-whites to exercise their voting rights. Obstacles connected and introduced at the state level included literacy tests, poll taxes, and English language requirements, to name a few examples. It was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the intent of our 19th Amendment was fully realized. I mentioned these exclusions up front as I opened my talk, the movement for Black lives as backdrop, because we must, with important diligence and intent, recognize that racial inequalities continue to persist today, whether at the voting booth, in the political arena, in our work or home spaces, or at the corner traffic light. The prison industrial complex, which disenfranchises citizens behind bars, further amplifies racial and ethnic disparities in voting rights. And traveling across the global suffrage story, identity-based exceptions also crop up in this wider suffrage portrait. And the slide in front of you is just to give you a sense of ways suffrage in the US unraveled, first across states before we had our federal voting rights. So just a quick note on terms. Suffrage, from the Latin suffragem, is defined as a vote given in deciding a controversial question or electing a person for an office. Partial suffrage, very important to this talk, references the ability to vote in elections on specific matters, such as municipal elections. And in many countries, women had access to municipal voting before federal voting. Suffragist, a woman who fought for the right to vote, and then suffragette is a term used during the suffrage movement, often to belittle or demean suffrage fighters. Over time, the term has become more popular and used to describe in a more positive light suffragists. The term was much more commonly used in the UK rather than here in the US. So Brendan mentioned this in opening up coincidentally, but Paxton, Hughes, and Barnes in their 2021 edition of Women, Politics and Power, and who I reference quite a bit in my talk because I use their work in my teaching, point out that the US and the UK, the only two countries that realize mass movements, are usually what we see and hear about most when we think about women's suffrage history. Popular culture amplifies this tendency in films like Suffragettes, pictured here on the slide in 2015, which tells the UK suffrage story largely around Emmeline Parkhurst. And then we have Iron-Jawed Angels in 2004, which tells the US suffrage side largely around the work and movement of Alice Paul. Quoting from Sumitra Mukherjee in her 2018 book titled Indian Suffragettes, Female Identities and Transnational Networks, quote, "One might be forgiven, especially in the Western world, for thinking it was only British or American women who fought for the right to vote, or that women in other parts of the world did not engage in similar battles." It's the end of her quote. Colonization and patriarchal dominance made suffrage a global issue and struggle. And these movements, global movements, are connected, as I've mentioned, across countries and people. So many scholars agree that a useful stepping in point to examine women's suffrage globally is to consider movements and timing. The interconnectedness between people and countries and continents is more nuanced and complex than just dates and people, but I'm going to start in this geographic chronology, and then I'll step back and give you much more specific examples so that we can add to the narrative as we travel. So I start with maps, and I'm going to begin with just giving you like a really quick overview. I'm not going to spend too much time on the maps because I talk about them afterwards. But you have Australia. I talk quite a bit in my talk about the 1902 date versus the 1962 date. Very important, distinguish, because in 1902 it was just white Australian women. Indigenous Australian women did not earn the right to vote until 1962, and yet in any map that you look at, they frequently use this 1902 date. It's similar to the US, that we use the 1920 date as suffrage for everyone when it really was not. New Zealand, the first country in the world to grant all its citizen suffrage, and I will talk a bit more about that as well. In Europe, I'm going to talk a moment about some exceptions. You have a good portrait here. Russia is interesting. That was in 1917, actually, but women didn't actually get to the polls until 1918. Finland in 1906, but interesting enough, Finland was still part of Russia in the 1906 period. But just want to talk to you a little bit, a moment about exceptions. So you see an asterisk, and that asterisk is always about the exceptions. Portugal, this is the exception for Portugal, very small, 1931 at the bottom. Women were given the right to vote and stand for election with the restriction that they had to have completed secondary or higher education. Comparatively, men only had to know how to read or write. In Portugal, all citizens who were literate were granted the right to vote and stand for election in 1934. However, some restrictions on women remained for elections to certain local administrative bodies that was under a 1968 law, and full equality of the sexes with regard to the franchise and the right to election to all bodies came in 1976. So it's just an example of when we see these dates, we have to read behind them to recognize the exceptions. The Americas. I spend quite a bit of time talking about Latin America, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the map. Ecuador is first. Chile, 1949, but interestingly enough, women in Chile had access to municipal voting rights in the 1930s. So I'm going to come back to talk about Latin America a little bit more specifically. So I'll move forward and look at Africa. It's interesting in Africa, there are lots of exceptions to this, but in many ways, the country is first in granting women voting rights along with men, because it came with independence from colonial rule. So it's a really important point to think about this. And the dates that you see here are about liberation from colonial rule, but also there's a lot connected to the founding of the United Nations in 1945, and particularly the UN Charter. I'm sorry, the founding of the United Nations in 1944 and the UN Charter in 1945. And that has significance as we see suffrage unravel across countries and states. And then Asia, Russia, of course, is part of Europe and Asia. So we just look at that twice, and it was first in this regard in terms of its space in Asia. I don't do justice to the continent of Asia. I do circle back at the very end of my talk, and I land in the Middle East. And so we'll be able to look a little bit more closely on some of the last holdouts. But again, in covering the world, I can't get to the nuances of everything. But if you have questions and I overlook something, let's come back to that at the end of my talk. So I mentioned that the UK and the US had mass movements, but scholars don't really attribute movement size as the variable to success in realizing women's enfranchisement. In fact, it's interesting because smaller movements were sometimes more effective in moving suffrage campaigns forward because they encountered less resistance, sort of falling under the radar, so to speak. True to most first wave movements before the war, they were comprised of urban, educated, middle and upper class women whose social strata and resources allowed them to organize and lead social action efforts. Many of these suffrage leaders around the globe had links or ties with Europe. Mukherjee, pictured here along with her book, who I quoted earlier, and who traces suffrage in India, points out that this also was true to many suffrage fighters in India, where Indian women had educational and marriage ties with the UK. So an important note there. In Egypt, in early 1923, Huda Shah Rari founded the Egyptian Feminist Union, which sought women's suffrage, but also reforms to personal status laws and increased educational opportunities for girls and women. Membership was, like herself, comprised of all upper-class women. That suffrage fighters were urban and educated brought its own set of obstacles. Paxton and her colleagues mention that, for example, in Turkey, political opponents to suffrage argued that because activists were mainly educated women, that the movement was not representative of most Turkish women. And that notion of upper class continues to crop in across other countries. Across the globe, movements did not always share similar goals or ideologies. Universal suffrage was an end goal. However, many countries placed education and property restrictions first on men's suffrage. This is a super important point to my work, and I mention this because when we look at women's fights and their activism for gender parity, they fashioned their equality goals around similar male restrictions. And in fact, the modeling of women's equality parameters around what was designed by and for men is one of the biggest failings of the liberal feminist agenda, of which suffrage battles were the lifeblood. In the reach for suffrage then, for women's suffrage, here in the US and in multiple countries around the globe, activities and activists were fighting for the vote using the same standards and also the same restrictions that countries had already established for men. So adding to this paradox, many women fighting for the vote are afraid to ask for too much and lose all, and so they move their campaigns forward incrementally with caution and restriction. So reach for the whole pie or try and get pieces of the pie. As example, Paxton and her colleagues mentioned that in Norway, Gina Krog, who's pictured here on the slide, supported a limited franchise for women even after their male counterparts had earned suffrage, because she believed that incremental access to civic entitlement would be more effective policy. And so those increments are common across many other countries. In cases of exceptions, and there were many, particularly in former colonies, suffrage came later for indigenous women than their white counterparts. So Paxton and her colleagues used Kenya, a British colony, as example, where European women earned the right to vote in 1919, Asian men and women in 1923, but Black African voters had to wait until 1957, and even then, property ownership and educational qualifications lingered until 1963. Another example is in Indonesia, where Dutch women had municipal voting rights in 1941, but not local women. The restrictions that we see play out across the globe caused many women in socialist countries to tag suffrage work as bourgeois and Western. Russia is the best example here, and the reason for the image on the slide. Although Russia was one of the early countries, as I've mentioned, 1917 in Europe and Asia, to give women voting rights, communism espoused a genderless state. So arguing for unique treatment of women as a group was actually in conflict with equality for everyone. Because of Western prominence in the suffrage narrative, Marxists and nationalists worldwide denounced feminism as Western and imperialistic, a phenomenon that's still very true today. One of the things that's interesting and related to this is while I was doing research for this talk, I came across a 2018 article in the American Political Science Review, and this is a peer-reviewed index academic journal. And the article is titled, quote, "Women's Suffrage in Foreign Countries." So think about that for a second. as to what is a foreign country and where. And what would that article actually be about, depending on who is reading it, right? I would argue that the word foreign is no longer a useful term as we think and talk about our own place, the US place, in a global world. So it's sort of an example of that imperialist critique. Importantly, while the suffrage narrative gets construed as a Western phenomenon, as I've mentioned, movement for women's emancipation is much more global. For example, in China, India, and parts of Asia, it goes back to the 1800s and before, where women were part of working class agitations, peasant rebellions, and autonomous women's organizations. So regardless of person or place, one constant to all suffrage campaigns was opposition. Global North colonialism of the Global South reinforced the belief that the public sphere of work and politics belonged to men and the private sphere of home and family belonged to women. Dominant to largely a Western Global North narrative, women bought into this public-private division, often scrutinizing their own roles in matters of state and nation. Many women fighting for the vote wanted to secure the needs of home and family first, without disrupting men's economic and social dominance. And opposition was stronger in some countries than others. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But that global North dominance of the global South is very instrumental as we see suffrage unravel for women around the world. So going back to New Zealand and then Australia. According to Paxson and her colleagues, New Zealand, the first country in the world where women earned suffrage, encountered some of the least resistance. In the New Zealand suffrage narrative, Kate Shepherd, pictured here, is dominant to their story, but similar to the US suffrage story, where we hear Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton frequently, there were an array of activists working tirelessly in front and behind the scenes. That's true here in the US and also true in New Zealand. Pictured here is Mary Teitai Manga Kehia and Aiken A. Tomahana, two examples of New Zealand women who fought for and won Indigenous Maori rights. So such an important part of New Zealand suffrage history. Like in New Zealand, Paxson and her colleagues characterized the Australian movement as also encountering smaller levels of resistance. But importantly, keep in mind, while many record the date for Australian suffrage as 1902, and this appears in multiple documents, it was not until 1962 that all Indigenous Australian women earned voting rights at parity with their white counterparts. Further, if you look at the 1902 suffrage crossover, British influence continued to exert dominance. The 1902 Commonwealth Franchise Act excluded men and women 21 years and over who were not British subjects. And in fact, British subjects lost their right to enroll to vote if they married a non-British subject. And the UK in and of itself is an interesting sub-story. When women in the UK earned the right to vote, there were age restrictions connected to that. So that's another important side story. So in Latin America, traditional values and a culture of machismo got in the way of women's progress. In fact, some scholars argue that Catholic countries, true of Latin America, were more prone to suffrage resistance than Protestant countries. Chile is an example that Paxson and her colleagues use as a country with very strong Catholic influence, where suffrage movements were less successful, although municipal elections pushed forward earlier for Chilean women before federal, as opposed to a country like Uruguay, also in Latin America, but cited as having less connection or less strength in their connection with the Catholic Church. Another example of religion as a variable in inhibiting women's suffrage progress is in France, a politically progressive European country. France was late on women's suffrage, 1944, as the commemorative stamp on the slide depicts. And this was out of fear that then, at that time, women's education was linked with the church. And so they worried that women would vote with the church, and that doing so would potentially harm the Republic. So adding to our country examples of campaigns around the world, women also organize at international levels. Pictured here is the International Council of Women that Susan B. Anthony with Frances Willard and Mary Wright Sewell organized in 1888 in Washington, D.C. Representatives from Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, UK, India, and Norway attended. And while international, it was mostly comprised of white women. True to many organizers at that time, suffrage was conspicuously absent from their meeting agenda. And this was out of fear that pressing for the vote might alienate conservative attendees. And some of those hesitations about, not pushing an agenda forward too high was really strategy about trying to sort of gauge your audience and see what would work where. And this was common in a global context. When we think about Susan B. Anthony's work and Mary Wright Sewell, we don't necessarily place them in a global context, but they were indeed engaged in those global relationships. Other early examples on international organizing bring us back to Latin America, where in 1910, the first International Feminist Congress was held in Buenos Aires. That's pictured on the right of the slide. And then in 1916, the International Conference of Women convened in Yucatan Peninsula, as pictured on the bottom. Paxson and her colleagues note that the International Feminist Congress in Argentina was a watershed moment that helped inspire women across Latin America. Pictured on the slide is suffrage fighter Matilda Gil Hidalgo from Ecuador, the first country in Latin America to grant women's suffrage in 1929. So, but despite being first, that 1929 Constitution included only those who were literate. Again, you see those some of those barriers crop up. And similar to so many other country examples, women who lacked formal education and the majority of the indigenous population in Ecuador had to wait until several decades later. There are many other examples across Latin America that intersect other country movements, and some of those Latin American examples actually push back on US women's efforts to dominate feminisms and the suffrage narrative. Catherine Marino, author of a 2019 book entitled Feminism for the Americas, The Making of an International Human Rights Movement, notes that Brazilian feminist Bertha Lutz, pictured at the top of the slide, was instrumental in pushing women's rights into the UN Charter and proposed what became the UN Commission on the Status of Women. As Marino writes, quote, in the wake of these events, numerous Latin American countries passed women's suffrage. So this is very significant. Lila Rupp, whose work is titled Worlds of Women, the Making of an International Women's Movement, is a prominent historian. And it's important to mention her because I use her work in my research as well. So in opposition to Western feminism, as I've mentioned, and similar to many fractures that we have seen in feminist movements here in the US, the international movement in the 1900s divided in what was two very distinct sides. One was Western upper-class white women who characterized suffrage as important for a civilized world. And there's a lot of problems that we could talk about in that characterization of civilizing the world. And I can come back to that in the questions if time permits. The International Women's Suffrage Alliance, or the IWSA, founded in 1902, was comprised of Anglo-Euro leadership. IWSA remains in existence today, now as the International Alliance of Women, with 13 full members and 24 associate members. Pictured here, importantly, is Carrie Chapman Katz, who helped found and lead the IWSA. And in this photo, she is arriving at the international meeting held in Budapest in 1913. It was the largest in the history of the organization, with 500 delegates in attendance. Sadly, because of war, the Congress halted its meetings after this 1913 event. And again, I don't know how many people place Carrie Chapman Katz in Budapest, but it is an important international connection. So the other side of the international suffrage movement were socialist organizations. The International Social Women's Conference, held in Stuttgart in 1907, as one example, sought to unify socialist movements in various countries in the struggle to win voting rights, importantly for working women. Another example is the International Communist Conference of Working Women, and that was held in Moscow in 1920. Here, Clara Zetkin drafted the quote thesis for communist women's movements. It was an effort to crush capitalism and transform women's work in the home into a social industry. And Zetkin is pictured with Rosa Luxemburg in the slide to the right. Her thesis highlighted that women's full social equality with men could only be realized by abolishing private property and integrating women's domestic activity into the new social order. Alexandra Kollontai, pictured in the middle, a prominent Russian women's rights activist, wrote in 1920 that the individual household needed to be replaced with collective housekeeping, where instead of women cleaning their flats, communist society would assign housework as part of the workforce. The efforts to socialize the home never succeeded under Marxist ideals, and women's double burden, as they call it in Russia, or the second shift as we know it here in the US, continues to persist today, and in so many other countries, right? That we do that extra work. So I'd be remiss to talk about the global suffrage movement and not mention International Women's Day on March 8th, or IWD. The day was launched in 1911 in Denmark by German socialist Clara Zetkin, and she was pictured in the slide, in my prior slide, with Rosa Luxemburg. So the day was first celebrated in Sweden and then Germany, and it fused tenets of socialism with feminism, championing suffrage as essential to advancing women's civic voice. IWD's civic and labor intersections reify Zetkin's socialist ideals. She advocated intentional recognition of women's rights with the full intentionality to link this with European affairs. She also linked it around women's universal suffrage needs, and she selected March 8th because she wanted to connect it and align it with European affairs, and also commemorate a 1908 New York City needle workers demonstration where women marched in very large numbers in support of the vote and unionization of needle trade workers. And it's important to note, if we think about that 1908 demonstration and the garment industry in New York City, it was comprised largely of immigrant women, so very diverse in their composition. International Women's Day was barely recognized in the United States, although quite common, in other parts of the globe, until its 100-year centenary back in 2011. And because of its suffrage youths, IWD got a lot of press this past March in parallel with the US marking this 100-year milestone. So if you did a Google search for IWD, you'd see a lot of images come up on March 8th connected to the day. So where does that bring us? After World War II ended, France, Italy, Romania, Yugoslavia, China immediately granted suffrage to women. France also quickly granted voting rights to several of its African colonies. Senegal and Nigeria are two examples. The charting of the United Nations in 1945, as I mentioned, had significance when the following year, 1946, got my dates wrong before, but I got them right now, the UN General Assembly recommended that all member states fulfill its charter mission, which was to grant women the same political rights as men. Even with this, women in much of the colonized world had to wait until liberation from colonial rule to exercise their voting rights. And before I leave this slide, very important, translating the Russian and its connection to the suffrage movement, the text at the top, the 8th of March, a day of rebellion by working women against kitchen slavery, right? Revolting against being relegated to the home. And the bottom Russian translates to say no to the oppression and narrow-mindedness of household life. Again, this is pushing against being relegated to the home and wanting to have access to civic voice, of which suffrage was a large part. Switzerland, a country with a long history of democracy, was one of the last European holdouts in enfranchising women. Paxton and her colleagues point out that Swiss women began to demand the vote in 1886, and between 1919 and 1884, suffrage fighters mobilized over 130 referendums on extending the vote to women. But yes, Swiss men voted against this. Similar to many opposition movements across the globe and largely Western in tone, anti-suffrage campaigns characterized women voters as mannish and argued that children and the home would erode if women participated in political and public affairs. While Swiss women earned federal voting rights in 1971, the small canton of Appenzell in Herhoden did not allow women to vote in local elections until 1991. That's 1991. And it's interesting, in many, many countries, we see municipal and local elections unravel before federal rights, and yet this was an inversion as it transpired in Switzerland. And many are so surprised by that 1971 date because of Switzerland's progressive space in the world. So, countries in the Middle East were some of the very last, if not the last holdouts, with Saudi Arabia as the last country to enfranchise women in 2015. And you see an image of a Saudi woman casting her vote for the very first time. And then, preceding that, United Arab Emirates in 2006, Kuwait in 2005. And even when those dates came out, there were still so many restrictions that barred women from going to the polls. Cultural ideology about whether or not it was appropriate for women to vote is something that still manifests in the Middle East today. Okay, so what have I overlooked? Oh, so much. I want to say I ask for your grace and your forgiveness for everything I have not said, and for so many corners of the globe that I have spoken of only too briefly or not at all. But before I close, and we can come back to looking at anything that I've mentioned in your questions, but with a presidential election in the US around the corner, I want to take just a very quick moment to look at women's representation in politics and pose the question, does women's long-sought fight for civic voice matter as we understand and reach for gender parity? This slide offers a very quick look at female heads of state and government around the world as of 2020. And it's interesting in updating my work from a prior year, several countries fell off the list. I just want to mention that if we looked at this in 2019, Croatia had a woman president. Of course, UK had a woman as prime minister. Lithuania The Marshall Islands, Malta are examples that had female heads of state. And at the same time, there are new countries that enter the fold. Switzerland, for example, longed to come to the suffrage table, but now with a woman as president. And as we look at the slide, you see Angela Merkel, who's had such dominance in her political leadership for a long time. And most recently in the limelight is Jacinda Ardern. And it's an interesting full circle, right? That we start with New Zealand as the country that was the first to grant women's suffrage. And now their president is leading with just extraordinary emotional intelligence and someone that is highlighted frequently. And in fact, if you look in the news right now, there are interesting news stories that ask the question, is there a correlation between countries with women heads of state and the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic? And so that's another little side thing that we could potentially talk about. Missing here is Taiwan, which is still considered under China. And this list is from the United Nations, which doesn't hold a seat, but Taiwan also has a woman as president. And in the next slide, just really quickly, it's an image of women's participation at the parliament level. In my long teaching career, which is long, Rwanda has always been at the head of the line because they use a quota system, but it's important to note that they also have, with intentionality, chosen women as the ones who will best rebuild a country that has sadly been decimated by war. So there's a lot more that we could say about that. So in getting to my closure, we've yet to see a US president, a female president. So we've certainly made strides in other areas of government, although we have a long way to go. We still lag significantly behind other countries around the globe. We had a small chance to shift this for 2021 in the strong slate of primary candidates pictured at the center of the slide. And of course, 2016 and Hillary Clinton did happen. And let's not forget Shirley Chisholm in 1972.
Yes.
Belva Lockwood in 1884 and again in 88. And although slightly too young to qualify, I think she's just like under a year too young, Victoria Woodhull in 1872, whose candidacy actually preceded suffrage entirely. And as postscript last Saturday, long after my talk was already prepared, I added the image of the 4 US justices, largely in tribute to Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her tireless work in championing women's political rights. The court has a 228-year history, and we've only had these 4 women justices, and that was only beginning in the 1980s, so significant to a women's rights story. So I really am closing now. Last slide. So in closing, we can see ways suffrage traverses a global span from exclusion to rights first granted to men to parity with men for many, but not all women around the globe. The shifting political landscape illuminates ways societal structures create and then enforce social identity codes. This 100-year US milestone sheds light on these codes as we measure women's hard-won gains, but also so many voting obstacles. Some of these, and I'll just name a few, name and address changes, legal status, rigid work schedules for part-time workers in particular, and that impacts getting to the polls, right? Rigid work schedules. And women are more frequently part-time workers because of that second shift and double burden. And then patriarchal ideologies continue to persist and block access to the polls. Agitation is one constant that pushed suffrage forward everywhere. And despite the lingering obstacles, especially in areas of race, agitators did crack that male mold. Michelle Bachelet, pictured here, twice elected as Chile's president in 2006 through 2010, and then again in 2014 and 2018, is quoted as saying, "Who would have thought 20, 10, or 5 years ago that Chile would elect a woman to be president?" End of quote. So in answer to the question, does women's enfranchisement matter? Absolutely. Across states, nations, and continents, when empires fracture, women are the ones to rise and lead the way. So I'm going to stop there. I do want to open it up for questions. I want to say how did I do for time? So yeah, I talked like a little bit longer than my 35 minutes, but not too much longer. I do want to mention that I'd like to open it up for dialogue, and then I have a couple of sites that I use in my teaching, and I'd love to take you there. They're interesting interactive spaces, and so I'm not going to do that immediately, but I will take you there if we don't have a question. And I know I said to any of my students that are present that if you ask a question and let me know you're there, I'm happy to pop in some extra credit for you. So thanks again, and let's open that up to see what your thoughts are, what you're thinking about my words, and what you could add to the conversation.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. LeSavoy. This was great. If you've enjoyed her talk today, she will be back with us on October 21st to speak about Fanny Barrier-Williams.
So important.
Yes. We actually have a couple of questions in chat to get things started.
Okay, so let me stop sharing and get into that chat feature because I didn't have that open. Okay, so okay, I'm not sort of seeing all the chats, but let me try and get to that. Brenda, can you see those questions and perhaps read them? Yeah.
So the first one is from Linda Salmon. Can you dive into the issue of the unraveling of women's suffrage globally?
In the sense of, do you mean like how it unraveled globally? I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
You made several references to the unraveling, and I'd just like to better understand it. So yeah, how, where, when?
Yeah. So if you go back, we see that the push for women to get voting rights started, we see New Zealand as the first country to grant voting rights, but that access to trying to get access to civic voice, was happening behind the scenes for such a long time. So the movement to gain voting rights, if I can go back and share my screen, and go back to the PowerPoint, and let's just step back and look at our maps, right? Can you see that? Are you there with me or no?
No, it's not sharing.
It's not sharing. Okay, let me go back and share my screen again. Do you see it now?
There we go.
Okay, so let's go back and look at the map. So I think in many ways, I've talked about movements and how movements unraveled, but you sort of see a progression here. So we have 1893 movements in New Zealand, and then you have this European picture. And if anything, I could try and bring you to the world. The reason I don't look at the world in one map is the maps are terrible and they do a really lousy job and they have incorrect dates. So I've sort of broken it up into continents for you. In fact, let me, I'll go through the maps, but let me take you to the interactive sites because that's a way that might give you a better global picture. But the unraveling is connected to trying to achieve what men had, right? Men had access to public voice, and women wanted access to what men had. And they modeled their own equality after this notion of man, which I mentioned. So you sort of see an unraveling in dates. I would say chronology gives us that sense of unraveling. And the movements connect us, across these movements. It wasn't just happening in the US. It wasn't just happening in Russia. It wasn't just happening in the continents of Asia and Africa and the Americas. It was happening everywhere. And yet women were enfranchised at different moments, depending on the politics, depending on colonization, depending on multiple variables, in ways that are sort of interesting. Switzerland, right? Like surprised to see what Switzerland comes so late to the table, or France. And yet we see earlier movements in what were countries that were part of the former Soviet Union, where gender equality was more ingrained into cultures, right? Less of a Western dominant narrative. And so I spent quite a bit of time talking about Latin America, but we see, sort of this connection to their own feminisms, in many ways pushing back against the feminisms that was cropping up in the US, but still there were religion influencing and getting in the way of that happening. The notion that women should belong in the home, right? That was something that was prominent. I mentioned that, in Africa we have issues of being colonized and not having liberation from countries that own them. And that in many ways that liberation allowed Africa to lead the way in granting suffrage to all citizens, whereas before they were vulnerable to colonial rule. Yeah, so, I mentioned that China and Japan came up after the founding of the United Nations. So that's another interesting piece that, leads to countries that are unraveling, and getting access to voice. And of course, in the Middle East, there are a lot of gendering that still persists that got in the way of that movement. I don't know if that helps answer your question. I want to, I have these slides open, so I'm going to stop sharing. Let me go to those slides and take you there. But is that Linda that you asked the question?
Yes, but I think I'm good at this point. So, if you wanted to move on to the next question.
Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, I misunderstood unraveling when you used the term unraveling. I thought it meant reduction in women's suffrage that happened later and withdrawing of the rights, and I guess I misunderstood.
Yeah. No, I think it's quite the opposite. I think the only point I make about withdrawing of rights is that we must be really conscious when we're talking about suffrage everywhere about exceptions and about the obstacles to getting to exercise that right? The fact that suffrage is granted is one measure, an important measure. We need to look and study that, but it doesn't always mean that you have access to the political and civic voice that comes with that legislation. Other questions?
So our next question is from Jackie Sherwood. Why is International Women's Day celebrated March 8th? What is significant about this date?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. So it relates to actually going way back to a movement under, that was resisting the Prussian Tsar. And that movement took place actually right around the edges of, it was actually in late February that movement took place. And International Women's Day actually extends out of that Prussian sort of women's rights movement, of which Clara Zetkin was strategically engaged. And so they sort of came out of that and established this IWD in 1911. I wish I had my dates in front of me about that Prussian movement, but I think that was in 1907 or 1908. 1908, and then 1910 was the demonstration, and then the day was officially sanctioned right after that. And it was very much aligned with this pushing back connected to labor movements. IWD is very much connected to labor movements and marching in labor movements. And so that marching for women's rights is all about that. And suffrage was, of course, an extension of this, right? The labor movement was very closely connected to suffrage. And the argument that the suffragists or the fighters that were fighting for suffrage around the globe were upper class women who had access to a platform for voice sort of pushes back against the socialist movement, right? The socialist movement was closely tied to the labor movement, and the labor movement was about working women. So that definitely wasn't about being upper class. It was very much about being in a middle class working space. But it's a great question. I've written a paper on IWD. You can go Google me and find it. And it's, you know, an area of, that I'm interested in. One of my interests is ways that the US didn't even know about the day until 2011. And that was about its 100-year centenary. But in other parts of the world, it's celebrated and very connected to the socialist movement. It's compromised, though. In Russia, it's morphed into a day that is now celebrated analogous to our Valentine's Day or Mother's Day, where Russian women are presented with flowers and candy, which transgresses its original socialist footing. So it has sort of morphed into different meetings in different places, but it's a great question.
Our next question is from Alicia. Hi, Professor.
Hi, Alicia, thanks for coming.
In the countries that had the stipulations of higher education of women in order to vote, was that successful voter suppression, or did it ultimately lead to more educated women in those countries?
I don't know. You know, that's a really good question. So did getting the vote lead to a better educated, you know, populace, right? I want to say two things that I want to say to that. That's a good data-driven question. And as a scholar, I want the data to be able to know for sure what the answer is. So my first answer is I'd have to go in and sort of find that exact question out. But what I will say is that paralleling this push for women's access to civic voice is also about ways education, which was really designed for and by men, began to open up for women, right? So educational opportunities are indeed, you know, stifled, right? Part of that is about geography, women not having, or anybody having access, anybody living in rural parts of the world not having access to urban spaces where education was unraveling. And, you know, here in the US, higher education preceded elementary and secondary, right? So we had colleges before we had any kind of public education. And those colleges cropped up to educate men for clergy, really. It was the classical curriculum of languages. And so, you know, women started to get access to higher education. And then, of course, secondary and elementary education extended out of that. And there's a lot I could say about women's access to education. But I will say that in getting access to education would indeed parallel with being a more educated populace to access the vote. One of the things that I had in my talk, but I eventually took that out, it's in my big long paper, is the countries that have mandatory, that introduce a mandatory application to vote, right? Australia is a country where if you don't vote, you're fined. And so it's a really interesting area of talk, because what does that mean if it's mandatory to vote? Is it better that we mandate voting so everybody exercises their civic responsibilities? Or are people just going to go to the polls and click off anyone without being educated about who they're voting for because they're fulfilling a mandate, right? And those are sort of the two sides to that mandatory election. And I had a slide in here that at one point, it's long gone, so I can't bring it to you, but it was the countries that do have mandatory policies on voting and what that means and how that translates. It's a good area of political science to examine. And I often ask in my classes, so it's coming up for my students, when we get to our unit on women in politics, for them to wrestle with what they think about mandatory voting and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think related, is it important that women have access to civic voice? I asked that question. Yes, super, super important. So that leads to so many other ways that we can participate as full citizens with, our male counterparts or any counterpart. Does it mean that we need women to achieve gender equality? I would say no. Bodies deceive us all the time, and some of our best allies are going to push a women's rights agenda forward. So being a woman, and if we go back to the slide of female heads of state, is not necessarily always aligned with support of women's rights.
We have 2 questions from Orange Cycle. The first, what do you make of the current far-right, mostly Catholic women who are now protesting against women's right to vote and or against the ability to vote independently from their husband or head of household in the US?
Yeah, I'm sort of horrified about it, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't want to bring in my own politics too much, but I think there's a lot of danger in that. It goes back to the opposition movements against passing the 19th Amendment and wanting to protect and secure patriarchy, and I would argue a conservative patriarchy at that. And when I use the word patriarchy, that is about a system that is male-centered, that privileges the category of man. In no way is it about men oppressing women or men having dominance over women. It's a system that has privileged the category of the social identity or social category of men and given them this package of goods. So I think there's a lot of danger on this, and I'm very much in opposition to that in ways that impact women's access to equal pay, in ways that impact who gets elected. Because if we are thinking about conservative patriarchy, the conservative patriarchy is about pulling back or rolling back women's rights. And that intersects access to reproductive health care, that impacts access to education and jobs. So there's a lot related to this. As I lecture on women in work, at the end of if we look at a woman's work life connected to a man, a woman has stepped in and out of the labor force more frequently because of the second shift responsibility in caring for children and family. And that puts her in a much lower earning percentile than her male counterpart, and it impacts her retirement and quality of life in old age. So these are all variables that we should guard against. Yeah, there's so much more I could say. I just recently read the book The Family. I don't know if anybody's read it or is familiar with it. And there's a Netflix series that is a documentary on it. And it's about the founding of the prayer breakfast that happens in the White House. And it's largely a conservative, a very religious, Christian religious conservative group that's very much about protecting the patriarch and really relegating women back into the home. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of danger there.
The second question, do you have hope that we will be able to maintain women's rights after the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg? I am worried about females being forced to bear their rapist children, as the laws banning all abortion in the South have no exceptions or are only struck down by court action.
Yeah. Well, I worry a lot about it. I'm sort of still reeling from her loss, and I want to say a couple of things about this. I do think that it's tragic, right? It's tragic in a number of levels. So we're vulnerable, right? We're absolutely vulnerable as this seat opens up, and who and how that seat will be filled remains to be seen. But I have a lot of concern about that. Related to this, there's a lot of criticism that has come to fold despite the respect and reverence of our justice and losing her, that why didn't she step aside sooner? And in fact, anybody that had seen the documentary on her life, the question is posed to her, and the question was, should you have stepped aside during the Obama administration so that he could have replaced you, and thus the seat would not be vulnerable. And I want to push back on that very hard, because my argument is that it shouldn't rest on the shoulder of an individual on when that person should or should not step aside. And that's a way too much to bear on her one shoulder, her very, two shoulders, right? That she had to worry about, should I step aside or should I stay because I want to protect the rights that I have fought so hard to secure. There should be term limits on this Supreme Court space. It should not be serving for a lifetime. And then we have a more healthy, systematic rotation that doesn't fall on the whims of an administration or a person. So that critique is wrongly placed, and I'm going to argue really strongly against that. So yes, I worry a lot about what will happen, and I worry about women's rights as a consequence of this, because as that court becomes more and more conservative, then we do have that pushback against women's reproductive rights. The global gag rule, something again that I teach in my next unit coming up next week, is a policy that continuously gets pulled back by Democratic administrations, reintroduced by the Republicans. And in that global gag rule, it says that any clinic anywhere around the world that is providing healthcare to all people, not just women, let's be clear about this. Reproductive healthcare is for everyone, right? Anybody that's providing reproductive healthcare clinic, that also in the scheme of that healthcare provision, that if part of that arm service is abortion, that all of their funding is pulled out. That's one arm to it, right? So if one arm to this is abortion, then all funding is pulled out. And the consequence there is that it increases women's needs for abortion, because then all of a sudden they're blocked from getting access to reproductive health care that is about preventing pregnancy, right? So that whole notion of controlling women and the way that's manipulated within government is absolutely problematic. So, we can have hope. We can watch the news now and let's see what happens with the appointment of that seat and who it is and what that person's politics will be.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, so I'll take you just really quickly to a couple of these sites. They're super interesting with the little time that we have left. I want to mention that dates, right? So dates can be super misleading. And in this particular timeline, you can interact with this. And it's nice to know that you can come to, let's go to 1962, that you can come to this particular timeline and you can see that Australia is listed as 1962, which is accurate, right? But it's not listed in 1902, right? And that's a problem when you look at these global maps, is you get a portrait that can be very misleading. And unfortunately, those that are looking at this global suffrage story, potentially are looking at these maps that do potentially mislead. So we do have, New Zealand down at the beginning here, and then we go back up and we've got Saudi Arabia here, but you can jump around and you can get a good global portrait that has accuracy. So I mentioned this as something I use. There's another really interesting site. If I go back to my PowerPoint, and I want to look at this, which is the Women in Power Index. And again, this is something that I love to use in my teaching. If I'm teaching face-to-face, I ask my students to go to these sites and they do little group projects with it. But the index is super interesting. You can look at, there are multiple ways that you can look at You can look at heads of state, you can look at cabinets, but if you look at a political parity score, which I think is one of the more interesting things, and you can filter it by region. So I'm gonna say, let's look at the Americas, right? And then you have the political parity score of the America. Well, let's add the United States to that. And look at where the US comes in, and you sort of see the US sort of falling into that, whereas the US not seeing it. Nicaragua, got Canada, Cuba. Let me clear that all and start again. So let's start with looking at the United States. We have a score of 17, right? So let's add Russia and Central Asia to that, and then you sort of get your, you're also getting your heads of state, you get your political parity score, and you just see so much dominance, right, as men. So let's add, anybody have any place that they want me to add? I could add the Americas, and then we start looking a little bit more, closely and, sort of see that. If I take out the Americas and add in, let's add in Europe. And then we start seeing where the countries fall. So the point is that as we enter in and put different countries in, you start seeing where the United States falls comparatively to the rest of the countries. And it's a very accurate, up-to-date 2020 database. So again, it's something that I really like to look at. So I don't know, Brandon, if you're gonna somehow or another catalog the PowerPoint slides, or I could send you the site so that you could look at that. I'd be happy to share that. The Pew Research Center is another really good research site to look at. Yeah, I like looking at these databases because it's interactive in ways that students get to sort of get their feet and arms wet as they move around versus just listening to me.
I actually just had someone ask if I could email the links to them later on. If you could email them to me, I will send them out to the people.
Sure. Yeah, it's useful because then you can play around with that. I could also send the one about the mandatory. I could go dig back and find the slide that was about the countries that mandate all citizens voting. What do you think about that? Should we do it here in the US? Anyone have a thought on that? Anyway, well, it was women, you go back to the database and the argument was, for those that aren't fond of our current administration, it was women who elected Trump. So, that's another interesting side talk that we could have, to what extent, and who votes and how did that influence the outcome. Although he did not win the popular vote, so really important to recognize that. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I could, also show you the UN snapshot. I don't know if anybody's interested in that. I have like a few minutes left. I could do that.
Are there any final questions?
Anybody else have any other questions or things that you're interested in, or countries that I didn't cover that you might want to know a bit more about?
Well, it appears that, we do have one last question. How can we educate young women so they don't lose rights they never knew they had?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think that two arms to this are that we need to really get into the high schools and the middle school and the elementary school and do a much better job in talking about women's rights. We are not really part of the history lesson. It is his story, right? So we're learning lessons that are largely about a story about and for men. So we learn about suffrage in the high school history curriculum, but it's a little snapshot. Women and girls are not really being taught about the rights that they did not have. So I wish that we could make a change there. I think that's a big, big starting point to educate young women and men, to educate everyone, right? So that we're all educated and we recognize the long fight for women's equality. It's an interesting dilemma. Why don't women have the same equality as men? Like what's the, what would be the reason for that, right? And it seems that it's sort of a very simple question. And that really is about, largely the division of public and private, and the material world largely being in the control of man, and wanting to protect and secure that material dominance, right? And that's really about pushing women back into the private sphere and doing work that's not part of our gross national product. And so they're absent of that, same economic potential. So I think, starting with education in the schools is probably the biggest leap. And then I think, we do so much in our own discipline of women and gender studies, but not everybody gets access to that. At Brockport, students have to take a perspectives on gender class, and many of the students that are enrolled in my classes right now are fulfilling that perspectives on gender class. So they learn about things that they might not have learned about. Not all colleges have that perspectives on gender, and I'm so proud that Brockport does. But I think it's really trying to press for more inclusion. So you have voice. You could argue at your district levels to change the curriculum for your own school districts, whether you have children or not. And we could work hard to try and change the curriculum in colleges so that all students are getting access to this knowledge. And I guess that would be a starting point. Education is always about power.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I feel like this is incredible since every history teacher I've ever had was a woman. Looking back now, I would have been so important to have a woman teaching about suffrage at each step in history. Really anybody teaching about suffrage. I want to say that your history teachers don't have to be women to be able to teach suffrage, right? Or to teach about women. And so that's such an important point. But I so appreciate, Alicia, you saying that it would be great to have a woman talking about women's rights. And so there's authenticity to that. So we could try and continue to push back on that and shift that. Where are the children's books on this? Do you know of any geared for younger and teen readers? There's so many children's books on this. There's a lot that came out that were about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's book for children, and there's a book that is about Hillary Clinton for children. There's multiple resources. A place that I would send you to is Seneca Falls, the Women's Rights National Park, and that's a national park. And so you could go to that site, and there's a shop connected to it that carries all of these resources. And there's also a really interesting shop in Seneca Falls called Women's Made Products, all products made by women. And they also, carry multiple children's books that are about this. And of course, I'm a parent, I have 2 kids, they're grown now, but my library, chock full of stuff like this that I could go pull off the shelf. So there's an abundance of resources, for parents if they want to talk with their kids about this. I do think that, sadly in our gendered world, these books get sort of pushed into a girls section of the bookstore. It's problematic, right? They're books for everybody, but they get divided and gendered in that way. So you want to be careful about that, because we can educate our boys and girls and all our gender fluid, non-binary people have access to resources that are important in education for everyone. So such a good point. It's not just for girls. Yeah, it's for everybody. Yeah, and how to really, the question itself is such a good example of how do we start to ungender? How do we begin to ungender everything so we're not caught in an adversarial space where we're fighting for women's rights, right? We should be fighting for social justice and rights for everybody. And I think that's important. I opened my talk saying that we have the movement for Black Lives as backdrop to this. We're talking about women's rights, but we have a long history here where Black, Indigenous, people of color have not had access to the same rights as our white counterparts, and to remind ourselves of that, right? So we've got so many battles to fight. Fighting for women to have civic voice seems so sort of primitive in this regard, and yet we're still in that ball game. I just got my ballot, my absentee ballot in the mail today, and I was super worried about that. So, exercising our vote, that's probably such an important piece now. Many people don't realize the fight for women's suffrage, and so recognizing that might encourage more women to vote. I show a film in my global class, so those of my students that are present will get to see it. And it is about the 2016 election and how here in Rochester, New York, everyone lined up to put their I voted sticker on Susan B. Anthony's gravesite. It's Linda Maroney's film. And significantly, I showed that in my class 2 years ago. I'm sorry, no, it was a year ago. And a student who was sitting in my class went and voted for the very first time and sent me a big letter afterwards to say that thank you so much for showing that film. And I never knew. And so I grabbed my dad and we went to vote together, and it was the very first time that I voted. And so not knowing is, a big piece here. And it's great to be able to become informed and then step in and exercise that right. I think, as just a closing point about this global suffrage piece, if we think about the US, and it sort of relates to my critique about suffrage in foreign countries, right? That to me in the year 2020 is a misnomer. Suffrage happened around the world. So if you're reading about suffrage here in the US, you're finding out about suffrage globally, right? You're not finding out about suffrage in foreign countries. I think that another step forward for us is to see ourselves as part of this global world, that we're not the dominant Western narrative, and that there are so many other examples that happened before us, alongside us, and with us. Really, really important.
Well, thank you, Dr. LeSavoy, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a wonderful presentation. I'm glad you mentioned Election Day 2016 film. We will actually be showing that on Monday, October 26th as part of a Zoom program.
Oh, great.
A panel discussion of local women in politics. So thank you again. We look forward to having you back later in October for your talk on Fannie Barrier Williams.
Great. Thanks so much, Brandon. And thanks everybody for coming. If you have any questions, you can always pop me an email. I'm happy to reply.